It was a quiet evening when Officer Greg Simmons patrolled the streets in his police car. He had been with the department for years and believed he had a sharp eye for trouble. As he cruised along the main road, he spotted a sleek black SUV making a turn at an intersection. To him, it looked like the driver hesitated for a second too long before moving. Something about it didn't sit right with him. His instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, he switched on his flashing lights and signaled for the vehicle to pull over. Inside the SUV, the driver remained calm. He sighed, checking his mirrors before pulling over to the side of the road. He had done nothing wrong, yet he knew that things could go in any direction during a traffic stop. With a steady breath, he kept his hands visible on the steering wheel and waited for the officer to approach. Simmons stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he walked up to the driver's side. He didn't greet the driver or ask for identification right away. Instead, he leaned slightly toward the window, his expression unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered in a firm voice. The driver raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "May I ask why I was stopped?" he asked politely. Simmons narrowed his eyes. "I said, step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. The driver didn't move. He had dealt with situations like this before, and he knew the law well. "Officer, with all due respect, I'd like to know why I'm being stopped. Did I violate any traffic laws?" Simmons felt his patience wearing thin. He had expected the man to obey without question. To him, this hesitation seemed like defiance. His hand instinctively moved toward his holster, resting on the handle of his firearm. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle right now," he said again, this time with more force. The driver noticed the way Simmons' fingers tensed around his holster. He remained composed but alert. "I have no problem cooperating," he said calmly, "but I'd just like to understand the reason for the stop." Simmons' heartbeat quickened. Something about this situation frustrated him. In his mind, this wasn't how things were supposed to go. Usually, when he gave an order, people followed it immediately. He didn't like being questioned. He didn't like the way the man in the SUV remained so calm, so sure of himself. The air grew tense between them. Cars passed by on the road, some drivers slowing down to glance at the scene unfolding. A few pedestrians on the sidewalk took notice. Some even pulled out their phones. The driver took a slow breath. He knew this wasn't just any ordinary traffic stop, and he knew something was about to happen that would change everything. The air between them grew heavy, filled with silence that felt louder than any words. Officer Simmons tightened his grip on his holster, his fingers hovering near his weapon as if preparing for the worst. He had made up his mind. This driver was being difficult. In his experience, when someone refused to follow orders immediately, it meant trouble. The man in the SUV, however, remained calm. His hands were still visible on the steering wheel, and his expression showed no fear. He had been in tense situations before, and he knew that how he reacted in the next few moments could make all the difference. He studied Simmons' face carefully, noticing the tension in the officer's jaw, the way his breathing had become short and uneven. "I don't want any trouble," the driver said, his voice steady but firm. "I just need to know why I'm being stopped before I step out of my car." Simmons exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. He glanced around and noticed that a few people had started watching. Some stood on the sidewalk, their eyes fixed on the scene. Others had slowed down in their cars to see what was happening. A few even held up their phones, recording the interaction. That only made Simmons more uneasy. He didn't like being questioned, especially in front of an audience. His authority was being tested, and he was not the kind of officer who backed down. "Step out now," Simmons barked, raising his voice. His thumb flicked open the strap of his holster, making it clear that he was ready to draw his weapon if necessary. The driver took a slow breath, his face unreadable. He didn't move immediately, but his eyes remained locked onto Simmons. "Officer, you don't have to do this," he said. His voice was not fearful, nor was it aggressive. It was simply measured, like someone who had been through this before. Simmons took a step closer. His pulse pounded in his ears. To him, the driver's confidence felt like a challenge, and he wasn't about to let someone challenge him. His instincts told him to take control, to make sure the situation didn't escalate any further. Then, in one swift motion, Simmons pulled out his gun and aimed it directly at the driver. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered nearby. The phones recording the incident now had a much different scene to capture, one that felt far more serious. "Out of the car. Now," Simmons shouted, his voice trembling slightly from the adrenaline rushing through him. The driver remained completely still. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. Instead, he slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Simmons tensed, his finger hovering near the trigger, ready to react. But the next thing the driver pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a badge. A badge that outranked Simmons. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the soft murmur of people watching from the sidewalk. Officer Simmons' eyes locked onto the object in the driver's hand, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a badge. A polished, gold-plated police badge that gleamed under the streetlights. Not just any badge, but the kind that only belonged to someone high up in the force. Simmons' grip on his gun tightened for a brief moment as his mind raced to process what he was looking at. The driver, still calm despite the gun pointed at him, slowly lifted the badge higher so that there was no mistake. His voice was firm but controlled. "My name is Darnell Carter," he said. "I am the chief of police." The weight of those words hit Simmons like a sudden wave. His hands trembled slightly, and his face paled. The realization came crashing down all at once. This wasn't just another driver. This wasn't some random man refusing orders. He had drawn his weapon on the highest-ranking officer in the entire department, his own boss. A few gasps could be heard from the small crowd gathered nearby. Some had already recognized Chief Carter, and now, with phones recording every second, they captured the exact moment. Simmons realized his mistake. But Simmons didn't lower his gun right away. His pride wouldn't let him. His mind was still trying to find a way to justify what had just happened. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe the chief would brush it off. Maybe, just maybe, he could still regain control of the situation. "Sir, Simmons started, but his voice faltered. He swallowed hard, the adrenaline making his head spin. Chief Carter didn't move. His hands remained steady, his badge held up as proof of his identity. He had seen many situations in his career, but this was different. This wasn't just a bad stop. This was a dangerous abuse of power. "Put the gun down, officer," Carter said, his voice firm but even. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Simmons hesitated. His fingers twitched near the trigger. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The world was watching. His fellow officers were watching. He had a choice to make, and he knew that whatever he did next would define his entire career. His breathing grew shallow as the silence stretched on. The chief didn't break eye contact. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. And then, at last, Simmons' grip on the gun loosened. His hand shook slightly as he slowly lowered the weapon. But it was too late. The damage was already done. The cameras had captured everything. The chief's calm, the officer's hesitation, the gun that should have never been drawn in the first place. This was not going to end well for Simmons. And deep down, he knew it. The tension in the air was thick. Officer Simmons had finally lowered his gun, but the damage was already done. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown larger, their phones still recording. The chief of police, Darnell Carter, remained calm, his badge still visible in his hand. He hadn't moved an inch since the moment Simmons pointed his weapon at him. Then, just as the silence was becoming unbearable, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Another patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing. The door swung open, and Officer Jake Turner stepped out. He had been responding to the radio call about a difficult traffic stop and had no idea what he was about to walk into. As soon as Turner saw the scene before him, his heart nearly stopped. He recognized Chief Carter instantly. His eyes darted to Simmons, who stood frozen, his face pale and his gun now lowered. Turner could tell something had gone horribly wrong. "Greg, what are you doing?" Turner's voice was sharp with disbelief as he hurried forward. He looked between the two men, trying to understand what had just happened. Simmons opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind was still struggling to catch up. He felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. The chief's voice broke through the moment. "Officer Turner, I need you to take control of this situation," Carter said in a steady tone. His face showed no anger, no panic, only the authority of a leader who had just been put in an unthinkable position. Turner nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Without hesitation, he reached for Simmons' arm. "Greg, I need you to step back," Turner said firmly. Simmons barely reacted. His body felt heavy, his thoughts clouded. He had spent years wearing his uniform, believing he had authority over situations like this. But now, standing before the chief of police, he felt powerless. The crowd murmured, their voices growing louder. People knew they were witnessing something big. Some whispered among themselves, others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The videos being recorded would spread fast. There was no stopping that now. More officers arrived within minutes. Some recognized the chief immediately, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as they pieced together what had happened. The chief didn't need to explain much. The scene spoke for itself. One of the senior officers stepped forward. "Officer Simmons, hand over your weapon," he said. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Simmons hesitated, looking at the chief as if hoping for some kind of mercy. But there was none. Carter's face remained unreadable. With shaky hands, Simmons unhooked his holster and surrendered his gun. His career, his reputation, everything was slipping away. And as the officers escorted him to the side, he realized that this was only the beginning of the consequences he was about to face. The scene continued to unfold as the officers processed what had just occurred. Simmons, still standing frozen, was surrounded by his colleagues, all of them unsure of how to proceed. Some looked at him with pity, others with disbelief. A few exchanged glances, as though trying to make sense of the situation. But there was no mistaking it. This was not just a mistake. It was an undeniable breach of protocol and judgment. Chief Carter, however, remained composed. He had witnessed countless incidents in his career, but nothing had ever prepared him for this. The trust that should have existed between him and his officers had been shattered in an instant. But he couldn't afford to let his emotions dictate his actions. His role as the chief demanded that he remain calm, not just for his own sake, but for the department's integrity. As the backup officers led Simmons away, Carter turned to Officer Turner, who was still standing by his side. Turner had an uneasy look on his face, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Jake," Carter said quietly, his voice steady, "I need you to stay with me. We need to make sure this is handled properly." Turner nodded silently, his eyes still fixed on Simmons, who was being escorted to a patrol car in the distance. The two men didn't exchange words. There was nothing to say. The damage had been done, and now it was about damage control. Carter pulled out his phone and immediately contacted the department's Internal Affairs Division. He knew that the moment this incident went public, it would be impossible to keep the details quiet. The officers involved would need to be held accountable, and Simmons would be the first to face the consequences. As the minutes passed, Simmons was taken to the station by another officer. His face was a mixture of disbelief and regret. His career, one he had worked so hard for, was slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't seem to stop it. He had let his pride, his anger, and his biases get the better of him. And now, there was no turning back. Back at the scene, Chief Carter took a deep breath. The flashing lights, the murmurs of the crowd, and the whispers of bystanders were all starting to blur together. But he couldn't let the chaos overwhelm him. He had a duty to the department, to the citizens he had sworn to protect. "Let's get the statement out," Carter said, addressing Turner. "We need to control the narrative before it spins out of control." Turner nodded, and they moved quickly toward the media representatives who had begun to gather nearby. They knew that soon reporters would be asking questions, and they needed to be prepared with a clear and concise message. Meanwhile, inside the police station, Simmons was sitting alone in an interrogation room. The weight of what had just happened began to sink in. He was no longer an officer. He was a suspect in a case of misconduct. He thought about his family, his colleagues, and the reputation he had built over the years. But now, all of that felt meaningless. As he sat there, the door opened, and two officers entered. They had already reviewed the body cam footage and other evidence. Simmons knew that it was only a matter of time before he would be formally charged with misconduct. His heart sank as he realized there was no escaping the reality of the situation. The air inside the police station felt heavy, as if the weight of what had just happened had followed Simmons through the doors. He was no longer a police officer with a career to protect. Instead, he was a man who had made a massive mistake, one that he couldn't take back. Every step he had taken since that moment on the street now seemed like a wrong turn, leading him to this point where everything was unraveling. Simmons sat alone in an interrogation room, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He had been told to wait for his statement, but the silence felt unbearable. His thoughts were racing in every direction, but none of them made any sense. How had it come to this? How had he let a routine traffic stop escalate to a moment where he pointed a gun at his own boss, the chief of police? The images of the situation replayed in his mind like a broken record. The confident driver, asking why he was being stopped, the calm voice of Chief Carter when he revealed his badge, and then the terror in Simmons' heart when he realized who he had been confronting. The guilt weighed on him more with every passing minute. Outside the interrogation room, the station buzzed with activity. Officers who had witnessed the situation, or at least heard about it, exchanged hushed conversations. Some were still trying to understand how something like this had even happened. Others were more focused on the larger question: what would happen now? Back in the room, Simmons' mind wandered to his colleagues, the people who had stood by him through difficult times. He had always believed in the importance of law and order. He had spent years upholding that belief. But now, that same system was closing in on him. He could already feel the sting of judgment from those who had once trusted him. The door creaked open, and two officers walked in. They were part of the Internal Affairs Division, the team tasked with investigating serious misconduct within the department. Simmons looked up at them, his expression tired. He had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, he couldn't shake the feeling that his career, and possibly his freedom, was slipping away. One of the officers, Officer Daniels, spoke first. "Officer Simmons," he began, his tone professional but firm. "We need to talk about what happened today. We've already reviewed the footage from the body cams, as well as witness statements. We need your account of what transpired." Simmons didn't say anything at first. His throat felt dry. How could he explain what had happened? How could he justify pointing a gun at his own chief, the person who was supposed to be his superior, his leader? There was no way to explain it. No way to make it right. After a long pause, Simmons finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I messed up. I shouldn't have. I don't know what came over me. I was frustrated when he asked questions. I thought he was being difficult. And then it just escalated. I don't know what happened." Officer Daniels listened carefully, taking notes as Simmons spoke. "Did you know it was Chief Carter when you first approached the vehicle?" Simmons shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't. I didn't know until he showed me his badge. But even then, I couldn't think straight. I panicked, and I did something I shouldn't have." The second officer, Officer Reed, spoke up. "You understand the severity of your actions, right? Drawing a weapon on any citizen, especially someone in your own department, is unacceptable. The footage is clear, and there are witnesses. This isn't something we can overlook." Simmons nodded, feeling his chest tighten. There was no denying it. His actions had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. For the next few minutes, they continued asking him questions, but Simmons' mind was elsewhere. He couldn't focus on the details of the investigation. All he could think about was how this one moment, this one rash decision, had cost him everything. His career, his reputation, and any trust the department had once placed in him were all gone. The conversation ended with Simmons being informed that the investigation would continue, but it was clear to him that the outcome was inevitable. He was going to lose his job. He was going to lose the life he had worked so hard to build. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a heavy burden, and there was no escape from it. As the officers left the room, Simmons sat there, staring at the blank walls. He had always believed in justice, but now he was facing the consequences of his own failure to uphold it. The thought of explaining this to his family, to his friends, to the people who had trusted him, was unbearable. He had lost everything in the blink of an eye. And the worst part was, he had nobody to blame but himself. The days following the incident were a blur for Officer Simmons. He had been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the internal investigation. The department's response was swift, as it always was with serious matters like this. But no amount of time or distance could change the feeling that weighed heavily on him. Each moment he spent alone, away from the department, gave him more time to reflect on his actions, and each reflection only seemed to make the reality clearer. He knew he had made a grave mistake, but the full consequences were just starting to unfold. The news had spread quickly. The videos recorded by bystanders had gone viral almost immediately, and the public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Many saw the situation as an example of police overreach, of an officer allowing his frustration to cloud his judgment. And, in a way, they were right. Simmons knew that he had let personal pride take control in a situation that required calm and professionalism. He tried to block out the noise of the media and the judgment that seemed to follow him everywhere. Even his neighbors gave him cautious looks as he left his house to take a walk or run errands. People whispered. They talked behind his back, and the shame felt unbearable. His mind constantly replayed the moment when he had pointed the gun at Chief Carter. How could he have let it get that far? What was going through his mind in that instant? He couldn't find any explanation that made sense. The department had been careful with its statements to the public. They were conducting a thorough investigation, they said, and no conclusions would be drawn until all the facts were in. But that didn't stop the rumors from spreading. Everyone had their own opinions. Some believed Simmons had acted inappropriately out of anger, while others wondered if there was something deeper at play, maybe personal issues or even racial tensions. But none of that really mattered now. What mattered was that he had failed. Every morning, Simmons would wake up and wonder how long it would be before his badge was taken away permanently. His colleagues had remained tight-lipped, but he knew that the trust he once had was gone. Even those who had supported him over the years began to look at him with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. He had always prided himself on being a good officer, one who followed the rules and treated others with respect. But now he had proven otherwise. One evening, Simmons sat in his living room, his mind lost in thought. The quiet of the room felt suffocating. The phone rang, pulling him out of his reverie. He picked it up, and on the other end, he heard the voice of Chief Carter. "Greg," Carter began, his voice calm but firm, "I need you to meet me at the station tomorrow morning. We need to talk." Simmons' heart sank. He knew what this call meant. It was the conversation he had been dreading. The chief didn't want to discuss the details anymore. This was the final step. The consequences were coming, and there was no avoiding it. The next morning, Simmons walked into the station, his steps heavy, his stomach twisted with anxiety. He had dressed in his uniform for what would likely be the last time. As he entered the conference room, he saw Chief Carter standing near the window. The chief turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Take a seat, Greg," Carter said. Simmons sat down across from him, his hands clenched together. He had no idea what to say. He had practiced the words in his head 1,000 times, but now they all felt wrong. Carter stared at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. "You know why you're here," Carter said. Simmons nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, sir. I understand. We've conducted a thorough investigation," Carter continued. "And while I understand the pressure you were under, there is no excuse for what you did. You jeopardized not only your career but the reputation of this entire department. The trust between officers and the public is fragile. When it's broken, it's not something that can be easily fixed." Simmons swallowed hard. He had expected the words, but hearing them out loud felt like another crushing blow. Carter took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm recommending your termination from the department, Greg. Your actions have made it clear that you no longer uphold the standards we required in this line of work." The words stung, but Simmons had already known that this was coming. There was no way to undo what had happened. He had failed the very system he had worked to protect. "I understand, Chief," Simmons said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I accept responsibility for what I've done." Carter nodded. "This is a hard decision, Greg. You were a good officer once, but this moment can't be overlooked." Simmons stood up slowly, feeling the weight of his words. "Thank you for everything, sir." The days following Simmons' termination were filled with a kind of numbness he hadn't expected. He had been given a few weeks to settle his personal affairs, but each passing day felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. His uniform, which had once symbolized pride, now felt like a distant memory. The respect he had earned over years of service was gone, replaced with the bitter sting of regret. He spent the first few days at home, trying to come to terms with the end of his career. The silence was deafening. His phone never rang with calls from colleagues or friends. It seemed like the world had moved on without him. Even his family, who had always supported his decision to become a police officer, looked at him with concern and sadness. They could see the change in him, the way he had withdrawn, the heaviness in his voice when he spoke. Simmons tried to reach out to a few former colleagues. He sent a few text messages, even called a couple of people he had worked with closely over the years, but the responses were few and far between. Some were sympathetic but distant, others simply didn't know what to say. No one wanted to get too involved in his situation, and in a way, he understood. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He kept thinking about the moment when he had pointed his gun at Chief Carter. How could he have let that happen? He had spent his whole life serving his community, and now all of that felt irrelevant. The shame of what he had done consumed him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his mistake would follow him for the rest of his life. A few weeks later, Simmons decided it was time to leave the house. He couldn't sit idle any longer. His pride, his dignity, and his sense of purpose were all in shambles, but he knew he couldn't let it destroy him completely. He took a walk around his neighborhood, trying to clear his mind. The fresh air felt good against his skin, but the weight of his actions still hung over him like a dark cloud. As he walked, he passed by the local coffee shop where he used to stop every morning before his shift. The barista behind the counter, a young woman who had always greeted him with a smile, glanced up when he walked in. Her face was neutral, but Simmons could see the hesitation in her eyes. It was a look he had seen so many times in the past few weeks. People unsure of how to treat him now that he was no longer part of the force. He ordered his coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the passing cars and people going about their day. A part of him longed to be back out there, in uniform, serving his community. But that was no longer his reality. The world had changed for him, and now he had to figure out how to adapt to a life without the badge. The next few days were a blur of job applications and interviews, none of which seemed to go anywhere. Simmons knew that his background as a police officer wouldn't be an easy thing to overcome. Every interview ended with the same uncomfortable question: why did you leave the force? Each time, Simmons struggled to find the right words. How could he explain that he had pointed a gun at his boss? How could he admit that he had allowed his own biases and frustrations to cloud his judgment? As the weeks turned into months, Simmons realized that his journey wasn't over. It felt like the hardest thing in the world to admit, but he had to come to terms with the fact that his past would always be part of him. But that didn't mean he couldn't try to rebuild. It would take time, a lot of hard work, and even more humility. But he had to find a way to move forward. He started volunteering at a local community center, helping with youth programs. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't offer any immediate rewards, but it gave him a sense of purpose. Every time he interacted with the kids, he saw a small part of himself begin to heal. He was no longer wearing a badge, but he was still able to make a positive impact on people's lives. Simmons understood that he might never regain the trust of his former colleagues or the public, but he could at least begin to rebuild his own sense of self. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees. But for the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could start making amends, one step at a time. And so, with each passing day, Simmons learned to live with the consequences of his actions. It was a painful journey, but it was the only way forward. The road to redemption was long, and the scars would never fully fade. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for him to find peace again. Months had passed since Simmons had lost his job, and the sense of shame still lingered in the back of his mind. But one thing had started to change. He had begun to accept that the past was unchangeable, and the only thing left to do was to move forward. It was a slow process, but with every small step, he felt like he was healing, or at least learning how to live with his mistakes. Volunteering at the community center had become a regular part of his routine. He worked with kids who were eager to learn, play, and dream, and somehow their energy lifted his spirits. He didn't wear a badge anymore, but he still had something to offer. He could teach them about respect, responsibility, and doing the right thing, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. He began to forge connections in ways he never expected. The kids he worked with didn't care about his past or the title he once held. They just knew him as Mr. Simmons, the volunteer who showed up every week to help them with their homework or play basketball. They didn't judge him, and in their eyes, he was just another person trying to make their lives a little better. One afternoon, after a particularly long day, Simmons sat on the steps of the center, watching the kids running around and laughing. It wasn't the life he had once envisioned for himself, but it was a life he could live with. He had learned the hard way that things didn't always go as planned, and sometimes life presented challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. But that didn't mean it was the end. It was just a new beginning, one he had to create for himself. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his sister. "How are you doing? I've been thinking about you a lot lately." Simmons smiled as he read the message. He hadn't spoken to her much in the past few months. Their conversations had become strained after everything had happened. She didn't know what to say to him, and he didn't know how to explain himself. But now, as he read her words, he felt a sense of warmth. "I'm getting better," he typed back. "It's been tough, but I'm working on it." A few moments later, his sister replied, "You'll get through it, Greg. I know you. Just keep doing the right thing, one day at a time." Her message was simple, but it meant more to him than she probably realized. It reminded him that even though he had lost so much, he still had the support of the people who cared about him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start rebuilding his life. As time went on, Simmons' confidence began to return, but it was different now. It wasn't the arrogance he had once carried with his uniform. It was the quiet assurance that he was a work in progress, and that was okay. He wasn't perfect. He had made mistakes, but he was willing to learn from them. That was the important part. One day, as he was working with a group of kids on a school project, one of them asked him, "Mr. Simmons, why did you become a cop?" It was a simple question, but for a moment, it stopped him in his tracks. He had been asked this question many times before, but now it felt different. The weight of his past wasn't as heavy as it once was, and for the first time, he felt like he could give a real answer. "I wanted to help people," he said quietly. "I thought that being a cop would give me the chance to make a difference. But I learned that sometimes we have to make tough decisions, and we don't always get them right." The kids listened intently, some nodding as though they understood. It was a moment of honesty, and it felt good to share that part of himself with them. That evening, after he left the center, Simmons thought a lot about the conversation. It reminded him that he didn't need to be perfect to make a difference. He didn't need a badge or a uniform to do good in the world. It wasn't about the title. It was about the actions, the choices, and the effort you put in to improve the lives of those around you. Months turned into a year, and while Simmons still had moments of doubt, he no longer saw himself as someone defined by his mistake. He had started to realize that every person had the potential for change, and redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey. Some days were harder than others, but he was determined to keep moving forward. As he walked down the street one evening, heading home from the community center, Simmons felt a sense of peace. His life hadn't turned out the way he expected, but he had learned to accept it. He wasn't the man he had been before, but he was becoming someone better, someone who understood the value of second chances and the power of humility. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful.